Hello and welcome to the Psychology Is podcast. I'm so excited to introduce you to Dr. David Buss. Some of you already know him, and if you're being introduced to Dr. Buss for the first time, I hope you're in for a treat. So I'll give a little introduction and then you can color it in however you'd like, Dr. Buss. Dr. Buss is currently a professor at the University of Texas, but really no introduction I can give here would really do justice to the true impact you've had on the field of psychology. And I just want to say up front that it really is an honor to host you in conversation. I feel like you're blessing the Psychology Is podcast with your presence. Just to provide a little context for our watchers and listeners, Dr. Buss is one of the founders of evolutionary psychology and the author of several books, including The Evolution of Desire, The Dangerous Passion, that one I read and it was great, The Murderer Next Door, and Why Women Have Sex. He's also been publishing scientific research prolifically since 1980. He's been decorated with awards from various professional organizations, and he's been named one of the 50 most influential psychologists in the world. There's another list that names you one of the 30 most influential psychologists alive today. We're publishing this podcast to the world just before the release of your newest book, which is entitled Why Men Behave Badly: The Hidden Roots of Sexual Deception, Harassment, and Assault. Extremely important topic, of course. And you and your team were kind enough to send me a copy in advance. So I had the great pleasure of reading it ahead of talking to you here. And there's no way that we can exhaust all of the insight in this hour or so long conversation. So I highly recommend the book to everyone. It's set to release on April 27th, 2021. So let me ask you this, Dr. Buss, do you still feel excitement in anticipation of a new book release, even though you've had many so far?
Yes, I do. Actually, this is the first new book that I've written in 11, 12 years. Mm-hmm. So the last one was with Dr. Cindy Meston, Why Women Have Sex. In a way, it's extremely exciting because it's the first new book, and it's a topic, conflict between the sexes, topic I've been kind of obsessed with for, I would say, about 3 decades or so. I think I published my first paper on it about 30 years ago. And it's a topic that I keep coming back to because it's such a recurrent theme. I mean, we notice it of course, it makes the news all the time now. And, there are current episodes in the news, and like Marielle Cuomo, the woman in the UK who got abducted and killed, big scale sexual harassment cases, Harvey Weinstein, Bill Cosby, and several people have commented to me, boy, it's very timely that your book is coming out with all these sex scandals, but in a way it's a perennial, because it just seems that every month there are, new ones that erupt and burble to the surface. And I think that one thing I would say is, after I spent about 3 years writing the book and probably 30 years on and off doing research for the book. But I at the end of the book, I kind of came to the conclusion that this is one of the most, if not the most, human rights violations, period. Of course, there are many human rights violations having to do with racism and bigotry and in-group, out-group distinctions of all kinds. But sexual violence against women, it crosses ethnic boundaries, political boundaries. You see these sex scandals erupting on the left, the political right, and in all ethnic groups. And so it's one of these things, and you're dealing with 50% of the population, that is women. And in terms of the actual victims, you have the primary victims, as they're called in literature. That is, those women who are victimized by sexual harassment or unwanted sexual attention or stalking or intimate partner violence or sexual coercion of various forms. And then you have what they call secondary victims, which is all the people who deeply care about and are invested in these individuals. So the mothers, the fathers, the brothers, the sisters, the male friends, the female friends, basically, the whole network of people, and they're affected, by the trauma experienced by the primary victims. And so when just if you talk about how widespread sexual violence is, I think it qualifies as one of the most or the most pervasive human rights violation worldwide. And so I hadn't realized that fully when I started writing the book, but by the time I finished writing the book, I think that conclusion is warranted. Just to throw out a couple of statistics, there are, and of course, as you know, Nick, studies vary in method and sampling, and so the actual estimates are going to bounce around, but you can ballpark it if you look at meta-analyses and then results that transcend the particulars of studies. And so ballparking it, something like 59% of all women have been subjected to sexual harassment. Canada, which is one of the lowest rates of intimate partner violence, still finds that 27% of Canadian women, will be the victim of intimate partner violence at some point during their life. And then, you get into rape statistics, and of course, those also depend heavily on how broad or narrowly the definition that the researcher uses and so forth. But you can ballpark the estimate that something like 15 to 25% of women will be the victim of a rape or attempted rape, during her lifespan. And this is particularly true during the young ages, so high school and college. So the point is that if you look at, and I'll mention a couple other while I'm rambling here. I'm sorry to ramble here, but one of the things that struck me in writing the book is just the sheer range of types of sexual violence against women. And so modern forms include things like revenge porn. And this is a relatively new study, but so typically a boyfriend or husband has access to sexual images of their partner. Then there's a breakup, and the person who is dumped looks to seek revenge on the woman who's dumped him. And so, state laws are just starting to catch up with these and make them illegal, but they're way, way behind the time. So one Australian study put the figure at about 10% of women have been victims of revenge porn. And then there's yet another one, and I'll just mention this briefly, and then maybe we can get to some other issues and some questions that you have. But that's what are called, used to be called photoshopping, but with the modern technology is called deep fake. So people will take, if they want to get revenge on someone, they can take an image, a face, and put it on a body and even animate it to look like they're engaged in sex acts that they're not engaged in or never have engaged in that way. And so, and so that's yet another form. And so the key point that I'm trying to make is that the types of sexual violence are extremely wide ranging. And one of the things that I try to do in the book is to bring all these different types of sexual violence within a unifying theoretical framework, sexual conflict theory.
Mm.
which is an evolution-based theory, and no one really has done that before. So all these different topics: intimate partner violence, sexual harassment, sexual coercion, revenge porn, all these are treated in the scientific literature as separate topics, but they're really um, different facets of common themes.
Mm.
So, and that's one of the things that I try to do in the book, is to kind of integrate all these different forms of conflict between the sexes.
You do a great job.
So,
You
yeah. So I'll mention just one other thing while I'm rambling, and then I promise I will stop. Is that has to do with the title of the book. When men behave badly, uh, the hidden roots of sexual deception, harassment, and assault. And in the UK, it's being published as Bad Men with the same subtitle for reasons that we don't have to get into. But when I started writing the book, I actually thought that I was going to uh, have equal coverage of men and women and the cost that they inflict on each other, because in sexual conflict theory, there for each adaptation in one sex, there are co-evolved adaptations in the other, and so you get these perpetual co-evolutionary arms races. But the more I dug into it, and I do cover I cover the ways in which women deceive men, as well as the ways in which men deceive women, and to some extent, other forms of cost infliction that women impose on men, as well as men impose on women. But over time, there was a shift in my emphasis to focus more on men and the bad things that men do. And the reason for that is because it became very apparent that when it comes to things like sexual harassment, intimate partner violence, stalking, the majority of the perpetrators are men and the majority of victims are women. Now, not exclusively, but it really leans strongly in that direction. And the more extreme the form of sexual violence, the more men tend to have a monopoly on being perpetrators and women being victims. And so that's why the title of the book came out the way it did, because it's an accurate reflection of the emphases that I have in the book.
Mm. That's interesting, because I can see that as the book unfolds, that initially you do talk more about the dynamics coming from both sides. For example, when you discuss why people have affairs, there are reasons that men have affairs and there are reasons that women have affairs. And you also discuss something that we'll get into right in the beginning here, the dark triad traits, and how that plays out when men possess them at a high level and when women possess them at a high level. But then as the book continues going on, and especially in chapters 4 through 9, you really then zero in more on men's bad behavior. So I can see what you're saying, and I'll just plant this seed now. One of the questions I want to ask you, and you might not have an answer, it might be difficult to answer, but one of the questions I want to ask you is, here, before the book comes out, I'm wondering if you anticipate what types of critiques or criticisms the book might get. And I also might even get more specific and ask you, are there any criticisms that you anticipate that you think are going to be unfair or come from somewhat of a missed understanding of the key points? And then are there any criticisms that you anticipate which you think might be fair? And I won't have you answer that now. Perhaps this will be a little teaser to listen to the whole podcast, but perhaps we can just plant that seed. But then the reason I'm bringing it up now is I thought to myself, well, I wonder what I would say if Dr. Buss turns that around on me and asks what criticism I might have of the book. And I would have to think more about that. Honestly, none really come to mind, but the only one I thought of, and this was when I was about halfway through the book, was that the title doesn't quite match the content. However, by the time I finished the book, I thought again about that, because especially in the second half of the book. The title's a perfect match for the content.
Yes.
So, okay, we'll come back to that. But
Okay.
what I
Yeah,
want
yeah, I
to
have some thoughts on that, which we happy to come back to that.
okay, okay. Well, perhaps, yeah, I won't forget to come back to it, and I'm sure those thoughts won't go away. So, I want to share three quotes from the book that I think are great caveats. Two are from you, and one was you quoting Steven Pinker. And I just think that it's important to kind of say these things ahead of time, qualifiers. The first is the quote you say, because of the profound differences within sex, so differences among men, differences among women, all statements about sex differences in this book carry the always necessary qualifier of on average. So this book also focuses mostly, although not exclusively, on heterosexual women and men. We we know a great deal scientifically about these populations, but there has been less research on conflicts among gay men and among lesbian women, among bisexuals and pansexuals, and among those across the rainbow of sexual identities and orientations. And so there's a critical need for research to fill this gap. So that's one important thing to acknowledge, both the on average piece and also that some of these dynamics don't necessarily apply to gay relationships. And then another quote that I think is particularly important is when you begin discussing sexual coercion, you give this caveat, and I'll just say before I quote here, to look squarely into some of the darkest, most morally repugnant facets of human behavior is very difficult. And I think sometimes when we begin to explain the worst of human behavior, some people think that it sounds like a justification for that behavior. But of course, it's not. And the only way that we'll ever outgrow the worst of our tendencies is by first and foremost understanding them, understanding the roots of them. And that's really why I think this book is so important, because you are identifying some of the roots of the most morally repulsive behavior that humans carry out. So this quote goes like this: to say that there may be evolutionary influences on the probability of certain behaviors never says anything by itself about whether those behaviors are good or bad from a moral perspective. That is especially true in the context of sexually coercive behaviors that are justly condemned for good reasons. And so, great analogy. In the same way that studying the multiple causes of cancer does not mean that one thinks cancer is a good thing, studying the multiple factors contributing to sexual coercion doesn't mean that sexual coercion is in any way acceptable. Identifying evolutionary origins of nefarious behavior in no way justifies or excuses it. And then, right in that same vein, you quoted Steven Pinker, who said, as soon as we recognize that there is nothing morally commendable about the products of evolution, we can describe human psychology honestly without the fear that identifying a natural trait is the same thing as condoning it. So just wanted to bring in those caveats. I think they're very important.
Yeah, thank you for doing that. I think they are important for uh, prefacing and reading the book appropriately.
Exactly.
And they're appropriate in part because there is the tendency, as you know, the naturalistic fallacy that people tend to jump from is to ought inappropriately, and this, I mean, this is also true with. I think it's especially true with evolutionary explanations, that there's this sense that somehow, if something is evolutionary, we have to throw up our hands and it means it's inevitable and we can't change it, or that it provides some excuse for bad behavior, and it doesn't. I think that clearly separating the is from the ought, the scientific understanding of causality from our morality with respect to bad behavior is extremely important.
Mm.
So I appreciate your pulling out those key quotes.
Absolutely. Yes. Well, let's dive in now to some of these hidden roots. There's a few things that I think I kind of want to just see if we can touch on a few things from the span of the whole book. And so the first one I thought we could start with is an explanation of the dark triad traits. Many of the explanations for the types of people and the reasons for why men engage in sexual coercion and harassment and assault often comes down to these dark triad traits. So, can you explain for us what these traits are?
Yeah, well, this is these obviously didn't come from me. I believe that Del Paulus at the UBC was the first or one of the first to originate identify these. So the dark triad traits are personality traits, individual difference traits that are narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. And very briefly, narcissism uh, is people who are high on narcissism tend to be self-absorbed. They tend to have a grandiose sense of self. They tend to have a sense of entitlement, and in particular, when it comes to men, high on this sexual entitlement. Um, and there are other facets. There are different formulations of narcissism, but those are some of the key elements. Machiavellianism. The people high scores on Machiavellianism tend to be those who adopt an interpersonally exploitative social strategy.
Mm.
So these would be people who view other people as objects to be manipulated for their own personal ends. They might be people, con men, or people who yeah. So I think that interpersonally exploitative as a social strategy, and that's carried over into their mating life, and so they adopt a sexually exploitative strategy when it comes to mating. Psychopathy is probably an unfortunate label, but those who are high scorers tend to it's like they have their empathy circuit severed. They don't have any empathy for victims. So, one of the hallmarks is people who torture animals when they're children, light cats on fire, or laugh when a dog gets hit by a car. Really, and then of course when it comes to people, like zero empathy. And these are really bad dudes. And I say bad dudes because there's a rather large sex difference in scores on psychopathy. So even among those three traits, the largest sex difference is in psychopathy,
Mm.
men scoring typically much higher than women.
Mm.
So these are individual difference variables that turn out to be, and this is one of the new things, and it's a thread that I carry through the book with intimate partner violence, stalking, sexual coercion, etc. That these traits, especially when combined with a short-term mating strategy, tend to be predictive of those who engage in these nastier forms of sexual violence, from sexual harassment all the way up through rape.
And this short-term mating strategy, perhaps that's self-explanatory for people, but what you're saying is that these are people who are interested in casual sex with no long-term investment to follow.
Yes. Yeah, and so this is measured. There are different measures, but Steve Gangstead and Jeff Simpson originally designed the first measure of what they call sociosexual orientation, where the items kind of capture it, like sex without love is okay. I agree with that. If you're high on the short-term mating strategy,
Mhm.
or I would have no trouble having sex with a variety of sex partners. I would like to have sex with a variety of sex partners, etc. So, and that's I consider it a personality difference. So there's no reason historically. It's really interesting. This is a side parenthetical comment, but in the field of personality psychology, sexuality has tended to be neglected. So even in the big taxonomies of personality, like the Big Five or the Hexago, there are no dimensions of individual differences in sexuality. And Dave Schmidt and I, former student, is now chair or head at Brunel University in the evolution and cultural program. What we found is that there are something like 7 dimensions of individual differences in the sexual sphere.
Mm.
And so I actually consider this dimension sort of the degree to which you pursue short-term mating versus long-term mating. I consider it a personality variable
Mm.
because it tends to be stable over time as much as other personality variables.
Interesting. Right. Let's talk about some of the fundamental differences. And again, with the qualifier, on average, there are always exceptions, but some of the fundamental differences that essentially give rise to, as you describe it, the battle of the sexes. So I'll just, say before I hand the mic back to you, what really stood out to me, of course, one of the main differences is the desire for sexual variety. And you cite a variety of studies that all converge on the conclusion that men tend to desire sexual variety much more than women do. And you have a kind of hilarious, like in your TED talk, you refer to this, in the book, you refer to this study, which has been replicated, where you have a man go up to women, strangers, and ask them, "Would you like to have sex with me?" And you have a woman ask strangers, "Would you like to have sex with me?" 100% of the women say no to those strange men, and approximately 75% of the men say yes to the strange women. And
Yeah.
this is just, I mean, the epitome of a study that highlights fundamental differences between men and women's sexual psychology. So perhaps you can elaborate on why that is, evolutionarily speaking. Why is it that men tend to seek greater variety? Why is it that women require much more investment of emotion and time and commitment before wanting to have intercourse? Perhaps you can just elaborate on this.
Yeah. You're absolutely right to highlight desire for sexual variety as one of the fundamental sex differences, and I think it's one of the ones that causes the most mischief, if you will, when it comes to conflict between the sexes. And it shows up in a variety of ways, as you say. There's that approaching total strangers on the street study, and that as you know, has been replicated in I think half a dozen countries. Or now you can get women off the 0 mark. By the way, if the guy is very attractive and charming, you can get 3, 4, 5% of women saying yes.
Mhm.
But if the woman is very attractive, then you get up to 85% of the men saying yes. It's a very strong sex difference, but also shows up in things like how much time uh, you let elapse before seeking sex or consenting to sex, how much investment you want before seeking sex. Even shows up in the sorts of pornography that males and females consume, where and sexual fantasy. So with men, it's variety of different women in their pornographic consumption, and with women, it tends to be male and female pornography is very different. So it tends to be with female pornography, that is what appeals to the female sexual mind, more emotion, more context, more build up. And so this sex difference in desire for sexual variety shows up in a million different ways. And as you know, in psychology, there's a lot of discussion these days about replicability and magnitudes of effect, which are very important topics. But this is one that's highly replicable and shows a very large magnitude of effect. In fact, it's one of the largest psychological sex differences that's ever been discovered. So why does it exist? Well, from an evolutionary perspective, it really boils down to fundamental differences or asymmetries in parental investment. So if you take the simplest case, what is the minimum investment a man versus a woman has to put in to produce a single child? For men, it's one act of sex. For women, it's 9 months of heavy metabolic expenditure, opportunity costs, and so forth. And so what that means is that, and this really it started with sexual reproduction. So most people don't know this, but at the beginning of the book, I even sort of start with that as a basic, that sexual reproduction itself, we take it for granted, but we evolved from asexual species where there was just one sex, mothers, and they produced daughters that were genetically identical to themselves. At some point, estimates vary, maybe a billion or 1.3 billion years ago, sexual reproduction evolved. And so once it started to evolve, what it evolved is in the direction of one sex being more investing than the other. So what that means is the high investing sex becomes the most valuable sex from a reproductive standpoint, and the lower investing sex becomes more competitive with members of their own sex for access to the high investing sex. So another way of putting it, so looking at it like from a female lens, given that they put this high investment in that's obligatory. So a woman can't say, I'm very invested in my career right now. I really only want to put in 3.5 months in this pregnancy. No, it's just part of her reproductive biology. And so it's obligatory in that sense. And what that means, though, is that the costs of making a bad sexual decision are much steeper for women than for men. In the extreme case, I'll say man and woman hook up one night, they have a few too many drinks, they fall into bed, they have sex. They wake up the next morning and the guy says, oh, I made a terrible mistake. I really didn't want to have sex with this woman. I shouldn't have had sex with her, and departs. Well, and woman, let's say, wakes up and realizes it has exactly the same reaction. Well, the cost to her can be very severe. If she gets pregnant, then she's gotten pregnant in an untimely fashion by a guy that she has not chosen as a long-term committed partner, and then even things like sexually transmitted diseases, women are more vulnerable to them than men due to the nature of our reproductive apparatus. And so one way of putting it is that the costs of making a bad sexual decision are steeper for women than for men. And conversely, the benefits of making a good sexual decision are much greater for women than for men. Now, since this is a theory of relative investment, it's very important. This is Trivers, 1972, a very important modification or elaboration of Darwin's theory of sexual selection. It's very important to keep in mind that men typically do more than the minimum. And in long-term committed mateships, both sexes are investing heavily. And so both sexes are extremely choosy, and both sexes experience heavy costs of making a bad mating decision. So what I'm talking about here with this desire for sexual variety comes into play mostly in shorter term mating contexts, although it gets complicated when you have deception about which mating strategy an individual is going to pursue. And so that's basically the, one way. Some people will capture this by saying sperm are cheap, eggs are expensive. And that's a bit of an oversimplification, but in a very brief phrase kind of captures the asymmetry in investment. And it's that asymmetry that investment is ultimately responsible for the sex difference. So looking at now from the male's perspective, the payoff of a short-term mating strategy tends to be much greater for those men who can successfully implement short-term mating strategy, or mating. I shouldn't say short-term mating strategy exclusively. I should say the reproductive payoff historically has been greater for men who gain sexual access to a variety of women, because their reproductive ceiling is much higher than it is for women, and so that applies to short-term mating, but also applies to kings, despots, princes, presidents who can attract multiple mates, etc. Another way of saying the same thing is that adding additional sex partners historically yielded higher reproductive payoff for men than for women. For women, from their perspective, adding additional sex partners doesn't increase their reproductive rate, unless their partner's infertile. And so what you have is this basic sex difference in the reproductive payoff of sexual strategies, iterated generation after generation after generation. And what has evolved is a male sexual psychology that is fundamentally different from female sexual psychology. So maybe I'll pause there on that point.
And so what's interesting to me to think about, and you do bring this up in the book, is the way that there are certain things, above all birth control, that to some degree changes the game a little bit. So if a woman is taking birth control and it's 98% effective, she is granted the freedom to seek greater sexual variety without necessarily incurring the costs that she would have if every one of those encounters possibly led to a pregnancy. But my takeaway, or my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, is even though, we've had birth control for maybe 50 years, I think, or a little more, and a little bit more than that. Yeah. So that being quite novel in the big picture. And it's okay. So what I'm asking is, do the instincts that have been ingrained by evolution persist even in these modern times with these new technologies? Or to what degree can a woman kind of override that evolutionary programming and choose and just kind of act differently than all of her ancestors ever did?
Yeah, that's a great question. And to some degree, it's an open question in that we don't fully know the answer to it. We know the partial answer at this point, and that is that I think it's very difficult to override desires. So you can prevent the expression of desire in behavior, but it's very difficult to override the fundamental desires that are part of our evolved sexual psychology. So one in a slightly different context, one comment that a male made to me is, after reading my book, The Evolution of Desire, he said that reading the book helped him to stay faithful to his wife, because when he found himself attracted to other women, he used to interpret that as, oh, that must mean I don't love my wife. Whereas once he realized that he had this evolved desire for sexual variety, he said, oh, that's my evolved desire for sexual variety. That doesn't mean I don't love my wife. I still love my wife. And so that caused him to be more sexually faithful to his partner. And so in a sense, he was able to override it with another desire to preserve his long-term committed relationship. So, when it comes to novel technologies like birth control, it is an open question. But with the advent of birth control, once it became very popular, so it was invented around 1960 or so, and then became widespread later in the 60s and into the 70s. and that coincided with what was called the sexual revolution, which is that there was a cultural movement to engage in short-term mating, short-term sex, and it also coincided with a sex ratio imbalance, I should say, where there's a surplus of women in the mating pool, which causes the mating system to shift more toward short-term mating. But what happened was that women would engage in short-term mating. That is, more women would. Some women always have. More women did, but they didn't feel good about it. They were more likely to, and studies have subsequently found this, including one that I co-authored with some other psychologists, that women are more likely to experience sexual regret, after a brief sexual encounter. More likely to, in college studies of hookups, women are more likely, when you ask, what is your ideal outcome of this hookup? Women are more likely to say, my ideal outcome would be a relationship developing from this hookup. When you ask men the question, they're more likely to say, my ideal outcome would be that it leads to more hookups, that is more casual sex. So I think even though it is true that women do have control, at least in the Western cultures where they have easy access to birth control technology, they can, as you say, basically eliminate what would have been a very costly endeavor, that is getting pregnant with the man that they didn't want to get pregnant with in an untimely way. And now they don't suffer those costs, but their desires for a relationship, for commitment, for investment on the part of the guy still persist even in the modern times. Now that's with most women, not all. There are, all studies show, including my own, that there is a minority of women who do pursue short-term mating with alacrity, if you will, so perhaps 10, maybe 15% of women, and who enjoy it and feel no regret and no compunction, etc. And this gets back to your initial point about the on average. One other reflection of this is that, which I thought was really a fascinating thing. So one other cultural invention is online dating sites. And one of the online dating sites originating in Canada is called ashleymadison.com. And their motto is, and you can look this up, their motto is, life is short, have an affair. And it's a very popular dating website, but it's basically for people who are married or in committed relationships who want to have some sex on the side. But when some hackers hacked it, some hackers were upset that when they requested that their profiles be deleted from this dating site, Ashley Madison claimed to delete it, but in fact didn't delete the personal profiles. And so they basically said, you better comply with our wishes, or we're going to release information about the users of this website. And when they released information, it turned out that, I can't remember the exact statistics, I mentioned them in the book, but the overwhelming majority of people on the site were men. And many of the women on the site actually were fake bots of photos of attractive women with fake profiles. And again, that's a kind of reflection of this male sex difference and desire for sexual variety.
That I hadn't heard of that event, and those hackers, as you said, ended up, they threatened the company that will release the names of the people on this site if you don't delete our profiles.
Right.
The company didn't delete their profiles, and so the hackers actually released the names and made that public information. And of course, many people were caught.
Yes.
And yeah, that I mean, honestly, pretty clever on the makers of that site to create a bunch of fake female profiles, because otherwise it would have been, if I'm remembering correctly, it was something like 22,000 men on the site and around 1,000 or so women. I might be slightly wrong, but that was approximately the ratio of real users. So the site had to create a bunch of fake female profiles to give men the impression that there was actually a fair shot at meeting somebody.
Right.
Yeah. Fascinating. Um, so let's talk a little bit about sexual deception, and I think it relates to what we've been talking about so far. And I want to hear you elaborate. And I'll just share that one of my takeaways is that a common strategy that men use, particularly those who are interested in these short-term mating strategies who carry that out, one of the ways in which that they deceive women is by essentially feigning interest in a longer term relationship, giving
Yes.
all of the social cues like the attentiveness, the interest in the woman's personal life, etc., that give the impression that they are interested in a long-term relationship when in fact they're only interested in a short-term relationship. So this is one form of sexual deception. Perhaps you can elaborate on that if you'd like, and share a couple others.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I mean, in a way, it gets back to that early, sex with strangers study of, would you have sex with me? That if men come right out, and we even showed this in our studies, in a study I did a while back at a singles bar, where, I mean, the more sexually explicit men are in their initial signals, the more it backfires.
Mm.
So, in essence, men who want a long term mating strategy give those signals of commitment, investment. Men who are interested in short term also give those signals of commitment and investment, because women are generally not turned on by men who just say, "Hi, I've been noticing you around. Let's have sex."
Mm-hmm.
So yes, men deceive women on that. And women, of course, are not oblivious to that. They're at least somewhat aware, and they've evolved tactics for seeing through the deception. And one of the things they do to see through the deception is they impose a longer courtship. So you expand that length of time, harder to carry out a deception over a longer period of time. And that longer period of time courtship allows women to identify other information. Is this guy married? Is in a relationship? Nowadays, they can Google his name or look up, and sometimes they find out he's married, has 3 kids, or has 2 wives and 3 kids. Yes, and of course, women deceive men as well. So sometimes women do the flip of that. That is, they give signals that they are interested in short-term casual sex when they're really interested in a long-term relationship. And so sometimes do what I call infiltrate the man's psychology, to the point where one day he wakes up and realizes he can't live without her, and he's in a long-term relationship. And initially he thought, oh, this was just a casual hookup. And so both sexes do it, and of course both sexes deceive about the qualities that the other wants in a potential mate. And so if you look at so there have been studies that I summarize in the book of deception in online dating profiles, where men will do things like exaggerate their status and income, exaggerate their height. Also, they put in things like sincere, trustworthy, looking for the right woman. That they give off all these cues to long-term committed mating, and women deceive by typically shaving off, on average, about 15 pounds off their weight. And both sexes are deceived by posting photographs that are sometimes older, or let me put it this way, not fully representative of what they actually look like. And so this deception runs both ways, and in predictable ways. You can predict it from both mating strategy, and you can predict it from sex differences in the qualities that men and women are looking for in potential mates.
So speaking of that right there, the qualities that men and women are looking for in potential mates, I think this is another fundamental difference in the sexual psychology of men and women. And you use the term a lot, mate value and overall desirability, and
Yes.
and this is it's good because it of course entails much more than physical attractiveness, and perhaps for women especially it entails more than physical attractiveness. So can you talk about some of the differences in how males versus females assess mate value?
Yes, sure. Well, so first I should say that the mate value, refers to consensual or agreed upon valuable qualities in a potential mate. And there is some consensus about, who is in the American system, and they have this in European systems as well. These are kind of, this person's an 8, this person's a 6, this person's a 10, et cetera. There's a fair amount of consensus about overall mate value, but there are also individual differences in what you find valuable. So some people, let's say, are into music or literature or Russian poetry or whatever, and so some people, there are individual differences in exactly what people value. But there's also consensus. So the mate value refers generally in this context to consensual mate value, and there are sex, and generally people seek those that are within their mate value range. So if you are a 6, then it's not a good strategy to go after an 8, because you have a lower likelihood of successfully attracting the 8. And also, even if you do in the short term, the 8 is more likely to dump you or to be sexually unfaithful to you. Our studies have found that. But you're absolutely right. There are sex differences in the qualities that men and women want in a long-term mate, and some in a short-term mate, although there's more convergence in short-term mating, centering on physical attractiveness. That is, physical attractiveness becomes really primary in short-term mating context. But in long-term, women are more likely to value men who have resources, men who have social status, men who are ambitious, have drive, and have a slightly older age, and have the qualities that are likely to lead to status and resource acquisition over time. Also cues to protection. So is the guy physically fit? Is he brave in the face of danger? Is he going to be a good provider, a good protector? Is he willing to be a good provider and a good protector, in addition to the ability? There's ability and willingness. And then men value, and this won't shock or surprise anyone, but my 37 culture study initially documented this, is that men value physical appearance, physical attractiveness, good looks more than women do in a long-term mate, and also relative youth. That is, men typically value women who are younger than they are. Women value men who are a bit older than they are, and then this changes over time. So and so that's why, again, getting back to the deception issue, people will deceive on precisely those sex-linked qualities that are desired in the opposite sex.
What would you say to people? I can imagine that some people feel that, and I know you know this, so I know you know this, but that putting a number on my mate value feels like a reductive, in a sense, or reductionistic, like you're reducing me down to a mere number. Or and then the people who would also say, like, I'm a married man, my wife is a very beautiful woman, and also her mind is one of the most attractive qualities, her intelligence, her wit, her humor. So just what would you say to that inevitable pushback on?
Well,
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah. So, well, first of all, what I responded to is your question about what are the sex differences. There are also similarities between the sexes along precisely those lines. So intelligence is one of the things that's most valued by both sexes in a long-term mate, as well as things like kindness, emotional stability, good health, and so forth. Similar political views, similar religious views. And so there are many things that go into mate value other than the sex differentiated elements of it. So what I highlighted was just the sex differentiated elements. And so, yes, and as I said, there are individually different elements as well. And so, some people are into sports and other people find sports boring. So, and so if you are into sports, then someone who finds sports boring might be lower in mate value to you. So there are those individual difference components to it. And yes, I mean, people don't like being reduced to a number, and it is reductive in some sense. But the fact is, mate value is not democratically distributed.
Mm.
So all men are created equal. All men and women are created equal, uh, and they should be in the eyes of the law and in terms of rights and so forth. But the harsh reality is that they're not in terms of mate value. Some people are more desirable than others, in the collective view. And
Right.
so you can, I don't know who the modern versions of this would be. Ryan Gosling, maybe, or I mean, it used to be Brad Pitt or George Clooney, but these are guys who are a bit older now, and then Scarlett Johansson, blocking on her name. Who's the woman? She's a superb actress who played the leading role of in the Tonya Harding movie.
Oh, what's her name? I know there's some listeners who are screaming it right now. I'm
Yeah,
forgetting as
uh,
well. I'm forgetting as
but
well. Maybe it'll come to us.
Margot Robbie.
There you go. Perfect.
That's who it is, Margot
Yeah,
Robbie.
that's
She's huge. So if you or I were to, let's say, go up to Margot Robbie and say, I think we're about equivalent mate value. Let's go out. My guess is we'd have trouble. Uh,
speak for yourself here. I mean,
yeah. So,
just kidding.
but
I totally get it. You're right.
yeah. So,
All
and it's Uh, I'll mention one kind of humorous anecdote where, I do this study. I teach a undergraduate class in psychology of human mating. And one of the things I ask is to women in the class, I say, what do women want in a mate? And one of the things they say is, I want a mate who's very generous with his resources. And so I say, so like a guy who takes his paycheck every month and then goes to all the street winos who are hanging out in the homeless again, gives us all those paychecks. She said, no, not that generous, generous with me. And so, but that kind of highlights also that the winos who are living on the street are not viewed by women as high in mate value as a guy who has a steady job. And so, which makes sense. I mean, all sexually reproducing species have mate preferences.
Mm-hmm.
And it would be bizarre if they didn't, because mating is one of the most important decisions you can possibly make in your life. I mean, it affects everything, from the children you have to your social status, to your future income, to your longevity. Everything is affected by that single decision of who you mate with. And so we have evolved as a sexually reproducing species, very articulate mate preferences, and those are enacted. And what that means is it results in, you could say, discrimination. People who are lower in mate value are discriminated against. It doesn't qualify for the any of the. It's not in any of the protected categories, but it's a harsh fact of life.
It is, right. Yes. Well, this perhaps is a good segue. And I knew that when I made the decision to try to cover many different topics within the book, to some degree, I was trading breadth for depth, because any one of these topics I feel like could be a whole conversation unto itself.
Yeah.
So, although there's much more to say about that, perhaps now we can talk about intimate partner violence and spend the rest of our time focusing even more on why men behave badly specifically. So harassment, unwanted sexual attention, sexual coercion, and then even rape, but specifically starting with intimate partner violence. So can you talk to us about the profile of, so first of all, as we've already established, there's this dramatic asymmetry statistically in terms of who is perpetrating this type of violence, and it's overwhelmingly men.
Yeah.
So
the extreme violence is.
Right.
So some have argued that that there's more of a gender symmetry, in committing acts of violence. And sometimes what will happen is when a fight breaks out, like let's say a guy slaps the woman or hits his partner, she will hit him back, and so there will be this kind of what seems like a symmetry in intimate partner violence. And some say, and there are some men who are victims of intimate partner violence, but the more extreme you get when you talk about actual injury and who's going to land in the hospital, who's going to end up with a black eye, the more extreme the violence, the more the asymmetry exists, where males are the more extreme perpetrators and females the victims.
Can you talk to us about the type of male or the type of relationship dynamic that gives rise to intimate partner violence?
Yeah. So yeah, as you know, I devote a full chapter to this problem of intimate partner violence, and it is a problem, and there are several things that are involved with it. And one is the one topic we just talked about, when there's a mate value discrepancy. And often what will happen is a man will get into a relationship with a woman who is in fact higher in mate value. And sometimes this occurs with an older man and a much younger woman before she's entered the mating market and had time to accurately assess her own mate value. And so over time, though, they get into this relationship. And then over time, she realizes that she's higher in mate value, or that this is not a good relationship. And so men in that context, when there's a mate value discrepancy, that's one of the predictors.
And I'll just jump in super quickly and say, I also think it's important to highlight your point that mate value is not static. So it's even possible perhaps that initially mate value is congruent, but then over time, there's a discrepancy that develops because mate value changes.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Thank you for pointing that out. Yeah, that nothing in mate value is static over time. I mean, it changes with job promotions, it changes with age, it changes with health status, it changes with all kinds of things. And so, yes, an initially assorted mate value couple can become discrepant over time. And in fact, you could say the odds of a couple not being discordant on mate value is the odds of them being discordant is very high, and the odds of them remaining identical over time as they go through life is very, very low. But that's part of what love and commitment are all about, is that we do stay with people and remain committed to them. But another predictor of intimate partner violence is guys who, so mate value is one, but guys who lack the resources or benefits to provide to women that are part of mate guarding or mate retention efforts. So mate retention is the term that I prefer. And the two generic strategies of mate retention are: you provide benefits to the person, you provide love, you provide attention, you provide resources, you make sacrifices for the person. And then the other is cost infliction. You can get people to do things you want them to do by inflicting costs or threatening to inflict costs. And as humans, we use both sets of tactics, unfortunately. But those who lack the benefits to provide sometimes resort to the cost-inflicting tactics. And it's very insidious, because one of the consequences of intimate partner violence is it undermines women's self-esteem. And to some degree, at least there's some evidence that self-esteem tracks mate value. So if you feel bad about yourself, you also feel you're not very desirable as a mate. If you feel good about yourself, you feel you are desirable as a mate. And getting beaten up does harm women's self-esteem. And so unfortunately, it's a tragedy. I think that's actually one of the functions of it. That is to get the woman to believe that she can't do better elsewhere on the mating market. And so it's a very insidious tactic. But unfortunately, as I mentioned, I think at the very beginning of our discussion, race vary from culture to culture, but Canada 20%, United States it's around 30% lifetime prevalence of being a victim of intimate partner violence for women. Even in the relatively sexually egalitarian cultures of Scandinavia, so Sweden and Norway, it also hovers around that 27% figure. So that's a substantial number of female victims of intimate partner violence. So there hasn't been a huge amount of press about it. But interestingly, there's been a bit more lately due to the pandemic, because what we saw in the pandemic was a spike in rates of intimate partner violence because women are women who are in the process of breaking up with their partner are sometimes stuck living with that partner, or due to the pandemic and lockdowns in certain countries, women are forced to live with their abuser and they can't get out of it. And so there's been a spike. Now, of course, economic hardship is another causal factor in all this. And there's, due to unemployment, again, not having the benefits to provide, that could be part of it as well, part of the spike. There's been a bit more of attention to intimate partner violence as a consequence of the rise during the pandemic.
It's devastating, the statistics. And as you point out, we really don't even know how high those might be, given how few intimate partner, like domestic violence situations, are actually reported. So many go unreported.
Yes.
So perhaps it just feels right to say that if any woman is listening now who has been a victim of this or a survivor of this, my deep compassion, and I hope that understanding the psychology of it is actually helpful. And perhaps this is the right moment to talk about some of the defenses against intimate partner violence. You talk about this in the book. One that really stood out to me is the coalition of alliances.
Yes.
The way that when a woman is surrounded by kin and male friends and female friends too, and people who can come to her backup, that can dramatically reduce the victimization in this way.
Yes. I think that's actually the most important one. I call them bodyguards. So social allies, and they could be female friends, male friends, and kin. So brothers, fathers, and so forth. These social bodyguards are extremely important, both in deterrence and in responding to.
Yes.
So a guy, husband or boyfriend is going to think twice if this woman has 4 strong brothers or an allyship, a coalition of females who's going to impose reputational damage on him for engaging in intimate partner violence. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why it's also spiking during the pandemic is that many women don't have that coalition of allies that can deter and defend against intimate partner violence.
Right. A devastating symptom of general isolation. Yeah. I mean, it just feels like it's so human, so natural to be surrounded by allies. And our society's kind of deviated from that perhaps somewhat natural social structure in many ways.
Yeah, I think so. With isolated nuclear families,
right.
It has deviated from that. And one of the things I should also mention is that one of the underhanded or insidious is the word I'm looking for. Insidious tactics that these abusers use is they try to cut off their partners' relationships with their friends and their family. And again, that seems specifically designed to cut off the bodyguards and isolate the woman so that he becomes her only social alliance, so to speak.
Right.
So
perhaps
it's very insidious and horrible, but we need to understand it.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so perhaps it's fair to say that the men who are most likely to perpetrate intimate partner violence are those who score high in the dark triad traits, these narcissistic, psychopathic, manipulative men who are with someone whose mate value is higher than their own, which they recognize, and who perhaps also there's just this general fear that the woman's irreplaceable to them, that if she
Yeah.
leaves, they'll never find someone of that level of mate value. And so with the whole, cutting her self-esteem down, it's like they create this illusion that the mate value is more of a match than it really is. You manipulate her perception um, of herself to basically reduce it down to being of the same mate value as you.
Right, right, exactly. It's perfectly well captured. It's
Mm,
and it's very insidious. So yeah, it's a combination of um, relationship factors having to do with mate value, social circumstances, and personality characteristics captured by the dark triad. So
mm,
it's that confluence of things, and
mm,
it's one of the things that I try to highlight in the book is that people often search for single variable explanations for things, and social life is more complex than that. And so this is at least an attempt to identify both the mate value, the relationship, the personality, individual differences, and the social circumstances, all of which converge to increased probability of, in this case, intimate partner violence.
mm. Let's carry this because some of these dynamics carry over into the types of men and situations where sexual coercion and harassment and rape comes about.
Yeah,
One thing that I thought was very interesting in the book is just kind of just unwanted sexual attention, perhaps the
yeah,
first degree of harassment, and just the way that men's brains respond to beautiful women, and the way
yes,
that literally, you use the term attention adhesion to
yeah.
that our men's brains are rewarded. We reward ourselves for looking at a beautiful woman, as shown in fMRI studies, and that's fascinating to me in and of itself. And then that, of course, so it's just interesting to think about, like, what are the evolutionary explanations of that? Does it relate to sexual variety, essentially?
Well, I think that in this case, it's that men's sexual psychology has evolved, which is housed in the brain, has evolved to be hyper attentive to women who are physically attractive and who give off cues to fertility. I mean,
Mm,
of course, men don't think about it. They don't think, "Oh, this is a fertile woman, therefore I can't help staring at her."
mhm,
But they are, as you said, this is work by John Maynard, who did this brilliant work on the attentional adhesion and finds that men have difficulty detaching from that stares, which women experience as uncomfortable staring or ogling or leering or whatever. We have a brain circuit called the nucleus accumbens, which is a reward circuit that when men see photographs of attractive women or attractive women in person, we experience a little palate of pleasure. So yeah, we do. That's kind of where it starts. But again, I think this is important to distinguish between desire and behavior.
mhm,
If all desires were automatically translated into behavior, we would live in a very chaotic society.
right.
And so some men, and this gets to your question about sexual harassment, sexual coercion, some men act on their desires,
Mhm,
and I guess another one that I point out in the book that is also linked to sexual harassment and some other forms of sexual violence is the male sexual misperception bias. That is, men, when a woman smiles at a man, this is the classic case. Woman smiles at a man thinks, oh, she's interested in me. And from her perspective, no, she's just being friendly or polite or even nervous. Sometimes people smile and they get nervous. And what we found in our lab study, we did a kind of speed dating lab study. This is with Karen Perlew, who spearheaded this. That men who are high on narcissism are especially vulnerable to the sexual overperception bias, and so and then the women who are quote victims tend to be physically attractive. Okay, that as men are more vulnerable to the sexual overperception bias with attractive women, which is a bit ironic given that statistically these are women who are least likely to reciprocate that desire on average.
Right.
So, but part of the reason that this leads to sexual harassment, or is one variable that is contributing to sexual harassment, is that some men genuinely think, oh, she is sending me sexual signals, and so I'm merely responding reciprocally to the sexual signals that she's sending, and then of course then that results in sexual harassment.
Yeah.
But it is also the case, and this is a point that I make in the book, that not all men do it.
Right.
Again, there are profound individual differences, and it's not that men who don't do it don't experience an attraction or a desire, but they don't act on it. And the men who are more likely to act on it are high in the dark triad traits, and they tend to be serial harassers. So, and I've interviewed dozens and dozens and dozens of women in different occupations, and the absolute consensus is they know who to watch out for. Like there's a particular guy in the workplace who tends to harass multiple women, and the same is true of sexual coercion, by the way. That there tend to be serial sexual coercion, serial rapists. So a smaller number of guys are committing a majority of the crimes of harassment and coercion. And so that's why it's important, even, and in a way, that's why I kind of like the title of my book, When Men Behave Badly. And because it's not all men, and it's not all men in all circumstances.
Right. On that note, you address the idea that some people have floated that all men are potential rapists. And to someone like me, that doesn't sit well at all, because I can genuinely say I've literally never had such an impulse, and it's like I have this revolt inside myself to even begin. Like there's a moment, I think, when you refer to a study where people had men fantasize about assaulting a woman, and it's like I can't even begin to go there in my mind, and I'm not virtue signaling right now. This is just very honest. So what would you say to this? What would you say to this idea that all men have within them some impulse to rape?
Yeah. Well, in a way, I mean, I have a couple of different thoughts on it, and I explore some of these. I think one answer is that we don't know the answer with conclusive certainty. And the reason that I say that is because you have to put people in the right situation in order to really gauge. So it's sometimes, and the situation that I'm thinking of is warfare. So if you are in a war, you're in a small intergroup warfare, and you've just vanquished the males in the enemy group, and there are these females there who are vulnerable without bodyguards. Would you, in that circumstance, engage in rape? Well, we don't know the answer to that, but I suspect that your intuitions are correct, that there are very profound individual differences. That some men, it doesn't matter how vulnerable the women, how low the costs, just would never do it. It would violate their moral sensibilities,
Mhm.
even if they had the impulse, and many wouldn't have the impulse. That is my intuition. But nonetheless, it is true that in those circumstances, I mean, rape in warfare, rape is one of the most predictable consequences of warfare. In warfare throughout history, in just about every place where there's been warfare, is that there's sexual violence. But it's probably the case. Again, we don't have studies on this, that not all men, not all these soldiers are engaging in it. It might be a subset of men who are more likely to engage in it. And based on the data that we do know, it's probably those high dark triad men who are most likely to do it.
Mhm. Yeah, good point. And yeah, I just, you already said it, but I just think it's worth emphasizing again, like this dark triad combination and the behaviors that can give way to, and specifically with that selfish, narcissistic sense of entitlement that uh like leaks into the sexual sphere.
Right.
I just think that's such a significant dynamic. These men thinking that somehow they're entitled to access to this woman's body and that her permission is just not a big factor. It's
Right.
it's just worth emphasizing.
Especially, yeah, especially combined with the low empathy.
Right.
You know,
Exactly.
so
Exactly.
I don't care what she feels like. It's
Mm,
what all about me. It's
mm,
what I feel like, according to the narcissist.
hmm. So what defense? Well, actually, okay, two things. One, highlighting another thing you already said, the male sexual overperception bias, right? This tendency to think that she's interested in me when she's not. And then that also tends to lead, as you talk about, to interpreting these sort of soft rejections as not really a rejection, as maybe even sometimes playful, or just taking it at face value. Oh, she said she's busy tonight, so she doesn't want to go on a date with me. So she's probably busy tonight, and I should ask her about tomorrow night. That
Right.
type of thing.
Yeah.
So although the responsibility solely lies on men when it comes to preventing coercion, harassment, assault, and all this, what can women do to minimize the possibility of being a victim of this?
Yeah. Of sexual harassment
Of sexual
specifically.
harassment, yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that, I think there are a couple things. One is that uh, in instituting clear and enforceable sexual harassment policies is the first one.
Mm,
Making people aware, and I think this is occurring. I mean, it's happening in my university. It's happening in other workplace environments that it won't. So there's policy, enforceable policy. They're setting up a social norm that this is unacceptable behavior. So, and that requires, and this is why men are so critical, in addition to women, in eliminating this behavior. So men who observe that should no longer tolerate it as
mm,
well. So in my workplace at the University of Texas, just very recently, like within a matter of the last, within the last year, we've instituted a policy at my university where if you observe sexual harassment, then you are obligated to report it.
mm,
So if you observe it and don't report it, you could actually be fired from your job. And so now people might think this is going too far, uh, but so I think policy, social norms, enlisting both males and females, men and women, to adopt these social norms. And then also there's the issue of bodyguards. Bodyguards are critical in intimate partner violence, preventing it, and they're also critical in preventing workplace harassment. So bodyguards in this case might be coworkers, and you know, and many women now do have the ability to report, and with the third-party observers reporting sexual harassment, that also has the advantage of taking the sole burden off of the victim.
Mm.
So previously, it was really the victim of sexual harassment who had the sole responsibility for dealing with it in one way or another. But this way, with third-party observers, that sole burden is somewhat lifted. Now, this is workplace harassment. There's also sexual harassment in other contexts, at
Mm.
rock concerts, at parties, at fraternity houses, and so forth. And that's that. I think some of the same principles apply here. You know, having body parts is really critical.
Mm. A lot of the energy behind men who do this appears to be just basic sexual arousal. I've also heard the argument that more than seeking sexual pleasure, rapists in particular, and beyond just harassment, but actual rape, are motivated by power and control. So if it were simply sexual arousal, to me, that almost seems like a somewhat simpler solution. I mean, you could almost just, it's weird to say this, but you could almost just encourage men like that to just masturbate more often and curb their arousal and reduce the intensity of their desire a little bit. But when it comes to desire for power and control, how can we address that in men who want to have control over women and want to have establish power over them? What's
Yeah.
what's the right response?
Well, that's an interesting question, a great question, and a very complicated one that I don't think we'll have time to get into that in great detail. But I'll just say one or two things about it, and that is that there has been this uh, dogma, might be too strong, but a belief that rape is all about power and has nothing to do with sex. And I think it's a bit of a naive view in the sense that, first of all, a lot of behavior is multi-determined. So there's no reason why it has to be about one or the other. It could be about both. And I think sometimes it is about both. Um, and in a way, this kind of, I think this kind of singular focus on the power has led to an impoverished view of the causal understanding behind this. So I wouldn't say necessarily sexual arousal per se, although that's sometimes involved. And there's a very disturbing study that I report in the book by Dan Ariely and George Lowenstein about when men are sexually aroused, they report that they're more willing to spike a woman's drink and get her drunk, or keep persisting in sex even after she says no. So I think sexual arousal is part of the causal picture, and it relates to the fact. Another interesting point, which I think is relevant, which we've touched on in other contexts, is that it's very difficult to study these things in a kind of cold laboratory setting where you're really not in the situation where you might engage in it. So most of us have never been in a wartime situation where we vanquished the opposing group and then have women who are left without bodyguards. And so, of course, as you know, it's very difficult to conduct psychological studies that genuinely put people in these, studies with high verisimilitude.
Right.
And so what people, and one of the interesting things about that Ariely and Lowenstein study is that men who are not sexually aroused report very low likelihoods of spiking a woman's drink and, persisting in sex. And it's one of the few studies that actually did put men in a high sexual arousal situation, found pretty dramatic results, which we've replicated, by the way, recently in our laboratory. Courtney Crosby, one of my current students, spearheaded that study. So okay, your original question, just getting back to it, had to do with the role of power and dealing with that. I think that Um, I actually think that it's not clear the degree to which power is a motivation when it comes to rape. It is perhaps for some. I think control of women. I mean, one of the things. Let me backtrack one second. From an evolutionary perspective, men have evolved to gain sexual access to desirable women, just as women have evolved to gain sexual access and mating access to desirable men.
Hmm.
Um, Most of the ways in which we have evolved to do that are involve things like honest courtship, investment, etc. And then there seems to be this minority. How big a minority is, we don't know. Tactic of using deception and coercion and exploitation and assault to get a mate, to keep a mate, to gain sexual access to a mate, etc. And so in terms of prevention, if you look at chapter 8 in the book, I realize I'm rambling around your
Yeah,
question,
it's okay.
but in chapter 8, I provide what I think is the most exhaustive set of women's defenses
Yeah,
that's ever been published. I mean,
a whole chart.
sorry.
As you put it in a whole chart too. It looks like.
Yeah, you have a whole table of women's defenses to sort of before an assault, to during an assault, to the aftermath of an assault. And I think it's really important to read that chapter and to focus on those defenses, which ones are effective, which ones are not, and also to get away from the victim blaming.
Yes.
So with things like tonic immobility, that this is a very predictable consequence of tonic immobility is that when the women are experiencing high level of fear and there is no escape possible, then they often experience, it's sometimes called body paralysis, and it's given other terms, where a woman feels like she can't move. Her body is literally immobile, and sometimes women get blamed when they experience that, even though it's something like 50% of women under those circumstances experience that, they get blamed for not fighting back, when in fact it's an involuntary response. And some have argued that it's an evolved involuntary response that is also seen in the animal kingdom in predator-prey interactions. So, and sometimes women blame themselves for not doing more to fight back when they experience this tonic immobility. And so I think knowledge of these evolved defenses can really help eliminate the blame that's often attached to women who are rape victims and eliminate the self-blame as well.
Yeah.
So anyway, sort of
No. And actually, I'm really glad you brought this up, because also right at the end of chapter 8, you do something that I really appreciate, which is you bring up post-trauma stress, and you do something that I find myself advocating often, which is you kind of drop the D in PTSD.
Yeah.
Not framing it not as a pathological response in any way, as a disorder, but as a very natural response to trauma.
Yeah.
And I think you use the analogy of, like, sometimes if you attempt to treat what you think is a disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, you end up just disabling a sensitive smoke alarm so that it doesn't alert you to a future fire.
Right.
And no woman or no one wants to experience post-trauma symptoms. It's very uncomfortable, but there's definitely evolutionary value to the hypervigilance, to the fear, and to these symptoms that arise as a result of these types of trauma.
Right. And I think that, with those symptoms of what's called PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, which may not be a disorder, as you rightly point out, may be saying, avoid, even if there's a low probability of a recurrence, that the damage is so horrific that that these symptoms are going to cause me to avoid, going over that hill, taking that path that I took, or even going outdoors. I mean, that's one of the symptoms is that people become more closed in. They refuge, which is another defense. So, yeah, I think that could be another beneficial outcome of understanding these evolved defenses is not pathologizing them. I
Exactly.
think there has been a tendency to over pathologize in our field.
Mm. Couldn't agree more. So I want to come back to that question I said I would come back to, and I'll just say right now, I think this is I've never had an hour and a half long conversation fly by as fast as this one. I can't believe we've been talking for this long. But let me just ask that final question. What criticisms do you anticipate, if any? And maybe are there any that you might think are going to be unfair and any that you might think will be fair?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and I can't anticipate uh, all potential criticisms. I mean, every book that's ever been published undoubtedly has critics. But one thing I would, I guess, single out that I think that might bother some people, and that is the notion that there are fundamentally evolved sex differences in our sexual psychology. And there's been a trend of late, even within academia, of what I call sex difference denialism. And I think the sort of impetus behind that is well intentioned, in that what people are sometimes worried about is that if there are sex differences, then they might be used to discriminate against women, in particular in the workforce. And so the intentions, I think, are good, but I think actually sex difference denialism, when it comes to our sexual psychology, harms women specifically. And I'll just give you one example that I talk about in the final chapter of the book, and that's laws and policies around sexual harassment and stalking, where these laws, it's actually fascinating from a legal perspective, because stalking and harassment, sexual harassment laws are among the very few that require the psychological state of the victim for it to be a crime.
Right.
So in the case of stalking, it has to instill fear in a reasonable person. In the case of harassment, a reasonable person would have to view this pattern of sexual conduct as sexually harassing. Well, this reasonable person standard is gender neutral. And again, you could say we want our laws to be gender neutral. But what our studies have found, and other studies, is that women experience exactly the same pattern of conduct in the case of sexual harassment as more harassing and more upsetting than men do. And the same with stalking. That is, the same pattern of conduct results in greater fear in a reasonable woman compared to a reasonable man. And so for these laws that are in part defined not just by the pattern of behavior, but by the psychological state of the victim, if we assume a gender neutral stance that men and women are identical, this will harm women, because women, first of all, are the victims more frequently than men. And how do we deal with this? What if the judge is a reasonable man as opposed to a reasonable woman? What if the jury consists of reasonable men versus reasonable women? Result in different outcomes. And so I think that this generic reasonable person standard, which in part, combined with this sex difference denialism, causes greater harm to women. And it causes, and in part, and I guess I would say that, so I think that that's one source. Some people who believe fundamentally in their heart of hearts that men and women are identical in their sexual psychology might be upset and might take umbrage at my book, because I do argue very, very forcefully that men and women differ fundamentally in their evolved sexual psychology. And I think the evidence bears that out. And denying that harms women. But I expect that some people will take issue with that. But what other elements of the book people take issue with, I don't know. My hope is that people will see that part of the goal of the book is to assemble it. There's a scientific goal and a practical goal. The scientific goal is to understand sexual conflict and in all of its many forms within a unified theory. The practical goal is that knowledge about the causes of these forms of bad behavior, from unwanted sexual attention all the way through intimate partner violence, harassment, assault, that understanding the causes can help us prevent its occurrence. And I think that men and women should be united in their goals to eliminate these social problems. And I think, there aren't any magic bullets. There's no single thing that's going to get rid of them all. But the more knowledge we have about the causes, the better position we will be to create cures for them.
Amen. And thank you for writing, just a masterpiece that really identifies these causes. It's so incredibly timely and important, and addresses, like you said in the beginning, a perennial human rights violation. So I really just genuinely appreciate it, and I admire you very much. As kind of a psychologist at the beginning of my career, speaking to you, a psychologist whose career has been in full bloom for a long time, it's such an honor. So
thank you. It's been an absolute delight talking to you, and I appreciate the degree to which you have informed yourself and are asking sophisticated questions so that we can have this interesting discussion about it.
Yeah, my pleasure. And I'll mention the title of the book again. So it's Why Men Behave Badly in the US, although many of our subscribers and listeners are actually from the UK. So you said in the UK, the title is Bad Men.
Bad Men, yeah. In the same subtitle.
Same subtitle, which in both cases is The Hidden Roots of Sexual Deception, Harassment, and Assault. Well, Dr. David Buss, thank you again. And congratulations. I'm excited for the world to have access to this book. It's awesome. And I'll probably read it again in time. And I'll share it with all of my students. I teach a human sexuality class and biological psychology, those two subjects. This is particularly relevant. So I'll be sure to share your work.
Fantastic. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Great chatting with you.
Take care.
Okay, you too.
If you like this video and you want to see more, please subscribe.